On today's episode, Redman Re-signs and what that means for the Bombers and their rivals. We also take a look at some trade targets for Essendon and Freo, and we answer some of your questions. All that and more on today's episode of Zero Hanger TV. All right, so straight into it, the big news, obviously, Redman re-signing for the Bombers. He was a pretty highly touted target for a lot of clubs. So what does that mean for the Bombers and their rivals?
It's a big coup, or re-signing, however you want to put it for Essendon. That was their priority, re-signing. They had him and Parrish both unsigned as restricted free agents, and there was obviously some well-documented interest from Adelaide in Mason Redman. Turns them down, signs a 5-year deal until 2028. And yeah, he was one of the big names. Obviously, one of the players that really only had one keen rival and his own club trying to fight for that signature. And the Bombers have come out winners. Big props to obviously Brad Scott, and Mason Redman said he's absolutely loving life under the new coach. So that might have been what swayed Mason Redman to stay at Tullamarine. And yeah, it's a bit of a blow for the Crows. They'll have other options to potentially look at or look in-house, but from a Bombers perspective, that is a big, big tick for their hopes of returning to premiership contention over the coming years.
Yeah. So speaking of the Bombers, we're going to move over to some trade targets. So who are Essendon looking at now in the off-season? Re-sign Redman.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So yeah, looking at maybe some players that they are already linked to or players that they could look at. So it's kind of key position talent at either end of the field that they would probably want. So Ben Mackay is one that they've been linked to heavily enough, and if they want a key defender to kind of work alongside Jaden Laverde, Brandon Zerk-Thatcher, and not even give more freedom to Jordan Ridley, he'd be one that they'd want to look at. Now, they have got decent cap room, so I think with the re-signing of Redman and potentially even Parrish, they could still afford to move for someone like Ben Mackay. Where that means they could get someone like Tom de Koning is probably another conversation, and he's another one that they've been linked to that would be on our list. So that's more of the key forward type player that they might be after, getting some more assistance for Peter Wright. We know that Harrison Jones probably isn't hitting the marks that they had hoped. Obviously, injury plays a part in that. Sam Wiedemann, the same, probably just hasn't found the form that they had hoped for after picking him up. So, yeah, the key forwards that they might want to look at. Obviously, we're kind of talking off-contract players available, maybe ones that might consider a move. Tom Fullerton would be a cheap option, kind of a ruck forward type, would kind of alleviate Peter Wright and having to do any ruck work, and maybe could be the combination that the Bombers looking for with Sam Draper in that kind of 1-2 punch. And you've got guys like Jake Riccardi, Jake Waterman, these kind of more athletic forwards who aren't going to be a number one forward, but certainly could be that assisting second forward role alongside Peter Wright.
Yeah. And we'll look at Freo as well. So they're a pretty interesting case. Obviously, they've got an interesting situation with their picks as well. So I'm not sure what they had to trade with, but who would they be looking at in terms of the off-season?
Yeah, so going for local WA talent that would still probably be off contract. So that's kind of what the mold we want to be fitting with these kind of lists. So Mitch Georgiadis is probably one of the bigger names for both WA clubs to consider, and the Dockers have Jai Amos looking pretty strong this year in just his second season. Matt Taberner, bit up and down, and hasn't been able to get on the park, obviously. And then Luke Jackson, do they want him as a full-time ruckman or helping the forward line? So Georgiadis could certainly help them with some of those list movements in their forward third. A few other WA guys, Devon Robertson, Trey Rusco, they're both unsigned beyond this year. Tyler Brockman has been floated as a potential one that could look to return home, so the Hawthorn small forward. I think more likely a West Coast have been raised as a landing spot for him. But if they lose Liam Henry, if they have some issues with their small forwards, and if they want maybe just a little bit extra pressure forward in that forward third, then he would be another one that they would look at. So there are a few names that we've put up for Freo this year.
Yeah, interesting stuff. All right, so moving over to the rookie rankings, and not a whole lot of movement. One new name in there.
Yeah, so Jasper Fletcher comes into our top 8 for the first time this year, the latest fresh face. Takes over George Wardlaw's spot. Wardlaw, probably has been, from what we've seen, one of the better rookies this year. But as far as being able to string enough games together, also battling injuries, still out for a week or so. So with that hamstring issue, so he falls out. Jasper Fletcher comes in, and then the rest of the top 8 kind of remains the same. So Will Ashcroft at 1. An ACL injury, how that'll play out, certainly opens the door for someone like Harry Sheasel to take top spot over the last 5 weeks, and even could be similar in the Rising Star race with the likes of Mitch Owens and Jai Amos also kind of fighting for that same award. So that'll be kind of an interesting one to watch out on. And then, as mentioned, the rest kind of say the same. Max Michelani didn't play, was managed. And then Bailey Humphrey had a pretty quiet game. Ruben Jimby's out for the rest of the year. So it probably wasn't, the week also that we would have have become used to, with a lot of change and most players, a lot of these players actually playing most games this season, which is usually pretty unprecedented for rookies. So that was certainly an interesting factor from the weekend. But Judd McVie has been our big riser over the last couple of weeks, and he's been really solid as Melbourne's small defender lockdown option.
Yep. Big shout about Will Ashcroft. And honourable mentions?
Yes, a few Tigers. Sam Banks has been pretty impressive in his first couple of games for the Tigers. Tyler Young did a pretty good job, and I think he kept Granger Barras statless against when they played the Hawks in that 1 point win. And Matty Coulthard's even another one for Richmond. It was pretty impressive when he came in to the game. Oliver Holmes made his return from injury and had some good glimpses that what we saw in the first 10 or so rounds of the year. So there are a few names that popped up in round 19 and could even make late runs for a top 8 spot.
Yep. Awesome. All right, so moving over to what's I think is becoming my favourite segment, answering some audience questions. So don't forget, you can always ask us questions on our Instagram and through our TikTok. So the first one comes from Penella Transport. Richmond are in need of a backup key forward. So who are they looking at there? Obviously, Jack Riewoldt probably is last year.
Yeah, it might not even be a backup. It might just need to be a new, number 2, if you want to call that a backup role. Jack's taken on the first string role, pretty much all year with Tom Lynch out. They get Lynch back, and that'll be huge for them in 2024 with what we've been able to see under Andrew McWelter the back end of this year. They've got guys like Jacob Bauer who was pretty unlucky in his first game, and they have kind of used him a little bit as a defender in the VFL this year, but he's popped up, kicked plenty of goals. Caelan Bradkey's another one. Their SSP signing from earlier this year. But if you want to kind of look at the rest of the forward landscape, look, they've been linked to Harry Himmelberg, where they see him as a key forward and as a supporting option for Lynch. That could be one. Hayden McLean's another one that can play forward, can help in the ruck, can even swing back. So maybe there are a couple of guys if they want to look at some key forward options. Himmelberg obviously a bit more pricier than what McLean would be. But there, maybe a couple of the key forwards. And as we mentioned earlier, Mitch Georgiadis still unsigned for next year. Could be tempted with a move to Victoria over WA, and Richmond, I think, would be a pretty suitable home for him as a trade target for the Tigers.
Yep. I think Tigers are in for a pretty interesting off-season this year. So the next one, comes from Josh Burton and Ben Herb. We've sort of meshed these two ones together. So obviously one of the most interesting off-season teams is going to be West Coast and what they're going to do in the draft and trade space. So we did touch on it last week with Michael Alvaro. But so where's that looking at the moment?
Yeah, so if you haven't caught the draft special episode, do check that out on our YouTube channel. But we did dive into a little bit of what West Coast could do. And a lot of that surrounds pick 1 and Harley Reid. If they do kind of go, we'll back Reid in, we'll keep him with that pick 1, and that is going to be most of their draft planning. They could, part with Tom Barras to Sydney. That could get them a top 10 pick. So they not only could have pick 1, but another top 10 pick, and then they'll have the first round pick of the second, the first pick of the second round, assuming they finish last as well. Their other option is, on top of the potential, draft pick that they might get from Sydney, which is likely to be their first rounder, they could split pick 1 and get up to 3 more first rounders. That would give them draft options for some local guys if they wanted to. So Dan Curtin's a potential top 5 pick. Mitch Edwards is kind of like a Tim English kind of type prospect as a pretty athletic, tall ruckman. So instead of having to put a lot of chips into English at the end of next year, when he becomes a free agent, they could instead kind of go for a younger, developing. They're not going to be in that premiership window just yet when English moves across, if they were to get him. So maybe that's one they could look at. Colton Belstrup and Colin Sanchez, 2 more WA kids who offer a bit of flair in the attacking third. So they're kind of from a draft perspective, if they want to split pick 1, there's some of the names they could get, and they certainly wouldn't be short on draft picks if they were to split pick 1 and even move Tom Barras on. From a trade perspective, they probably just want young, solid role players. They've flagged that they're going to be attacking the draft. They're not going to be looking at free agents all too much. Tyler Brockman's probably one that's been floated as an option for West Coast as a small forward who might be wanting to go back to WA, as we mentioned. So Overall, from a trade space, it's mostly going to be around the players that they're going to keep or the players that they move on, what they're going to get in return, and a lot of that attention is going to go to the draft.
Yeah, really interesting stuff to come. The next one comes from Caleb Kirk. So just latest on the doggies.
Hasn't been a lot as far as I think players that have been linked to the Dogs. It's more their own assets and where they could be going. Jordan Sweet's one I think we flagged a few months ago as like a really well-performing ruckman in the VFL, and these are the kind of guys that get a lot of attention, especially with how in-demand rucks can be and how fluid the kind of movement around rucks are in trade and player movement spaces. So he's been arguably the best ruckman in the VFL this year, and I think Port Adelaide are one that have popped up as a potential interested suitor. Bailey Williams, a free agent this year. I think the Crows were linked at him at one point this year as well. And the interesting thing about the Dogs, they're one of the clubs that have 2 first-round picks. So I think they're likely to go to the draft. I don't see them being one of the clubs that join the race for Harley Reid. When you've got GWS and Melbourne are the other two clubs that have multiple first-round picks this year and probably would do that. I think they'll probably stray away and either look at other draft options. Obviously, they have that pick from Brisbane that they lost after losing Josh Dunkley. And then the other one was Bailey Smith's obviously popped up. He's contracted, I think more unlikely to leave, but there has been obviously some interest from Geelong. So yeah, as far as the Dogs trade space, a lot of it has probably been focused on their own players and less so on what they're looking at. They'll obviously have to kind of weigh up what they do with their first round picks this year as well, given that Jordan Croft, a father-son prospect, is looking like a top 15 selection. So do they need to hold their earlier pick and hopefully no one's bid on him before then, or do they need to trade that, match the bid with the later picks they get, and then potentially move back into the first round or hold that later first round pick? So it's a bit of an interesting space for the Bulldogs come the draft and trade period, given where Croft is going to sit in that first round selection conversation.
Yeah, spicy stuff. All right, so next one from Wee Cromers one. So obviously Murray out with an ACL. So what are Adelaide's options in terms of key defender?
It's an interesting kind of few days for them. Like you said, they lose Nick Murray to an ACL for what you can expect is 12 months. Tom Doedee, who they want to keep, also out with an ACL and will probably miss the start of next season. They lose out on getting Mason Redman in. So does that really open the door for them to start looking into the key defender market? Like they've seen some good signs from Josh Worrell. Max Marklani is more that smaller lockdown defender. So they're getting some good minutes into these guys at a great time, and it kind of just leaves Jordan Butts as that leading man in defence. James Borlase is supposed to be someone that they have some pretty high regard in at sample level, but 2024 is going to be a really critical year for Adelaide. They've made a pretty big jump this year. They might miss out on finals, but you can really hope that they will be making a top 8 stand next year. But they're going to be probably banking on a pretty experienced backline to get them there, and without Murray and potentially without Doedee, at least for the first half of the year, and it all relying on Butts, maybe they do look into getting some experience. They're going to be pretty late into the conversation when you've got guys like Ben Mackay, Asava Radigalea already probably having wheels in motion to where they might be playing or what they're going to be doing in the next few months to look toward 2024. So the Crows are going to be a pretty late arrival. Some of the other key defenders that pop up, Adam Tomlinson and Tom Cleary, 2 guys that are contracted, aren't going to break their bank, and they could still be solid role players to fill in for the first 6 months or so. And then once they get Murray back, they can see where things go from there. So they're probably 2 guys that Adelaide could consider. Not going to cost a lot. And like I said, they might be too late to try and pick off a player like Asava Radigalea or Ben Mackay.
Yeah. Interesting. And last question comes from Amali. Just our thoughts on Tassie. Obviously, it was a big lot of news when it first dropped, and it's been a little bit quiet since then. But yeah, what are our thoughts on Tassie, especially now, given the champs wrap up?
Yeah, well, it was, I think it was the obvious call. They're the obvious state or position for the 19th licence, which they now have. 2028 season is flagged as the likely entry date, and I think the AFL are doing a pretty good job in kind of having that time to prepare and maybe less rushed, as we saw with Gold Coast and GWS. And then I think a lot of questions come in with the standard of the competition and bringing in 19th side, Tasmania, what they're kind of, the talent that they can acquire. They're going to have heaps of concessions, just like GWS and Gold Coast did. That are going to help them build that list initially. On top of that, the development pathways have been absolutely stellar across the last couple of seasons to see 2 midfielders ahead of this year's draft, likely top 5 picks in Riley Sanders and Colby McKercher. So there'll be 2 players that they'll already have some pretty strong sights on over the coming years before they enter the league. And then you have to look at guys like John Newcombe, Nick Martin, Alex Chincotta, the type of players that weren't even in the AFL, got a chance through some of the new recruitment mechanisms, and now some pretty top names. And guys like Nick Martin and Newcombe could both be All Australian squad members this year after only a couple of years in the system. So I don't think that Tassie are going to have too many issues compared to what maybe GWS and Gold Coast had. It's a footballing state. They'll be doing pretty well for crowd numbers, I think, and obviously a lot hinges on finances. They've got the money from the league. I don't think much is changing there. Obviously some questions on their stadium, but I think it'll, like I said, with the time that they've been given and the patience that the AFL's kind of had and not bringing them in so quickly, then I think things will be pretty smooth by the time they're in.
Yep. I'm just excited for another stadium with a roof. That's what I'm holding out for.
If there's a roof, yeah.
All right, so to wrap up, as always, we're going to move over to our MVP. And Nick Dacos did not poll in that game against Port.
Copped a tag. Willem Drew did pretty well. I think Nick Dacos still came away with 25 touches and fair few clearances.
Classic.
And ends up 50. So it wasn't exactly his quietest game. Yeah. But Willem Drew did do a pretty good job of putting the clamps on him to an extent, and then moved to Jordan DeGoey. So there were obviously at least 5 or 6 players probably ahead of Dacos from the game that polled votes, obviously. So went without one on Saturday night. That kind of opened the door. Marcus Bontempelli, arguably the Bulldogs' best, has now closed that gap to 1 vote between the top 2. Christian Petrarca not too far behind in 3rd, and some of the other guys like Tim Taranto, Lockie Neal, polling votes to sit in the top 5. Then you got Dawson, Green, Sinclair, Rosie, also polling to now hold their spots or find spots in the top 10. Zach Butters as well, right with Rosie in that conversation, just around that back end of the top 10 or after. And some perfect games over the weekend. So Max Gawn, 20-vote game, along with Luke Parker, Charlie Curnow for his 10-goal effort, and Jack Steele as well. So it's real close with 5 rounds to go.
Yeah. Do you think it's a top 3 now with Dacos, Petrarca and Bont?
Yeah, it's going to be pretty hard for guys like Neal and Taranto to really make up that deficit. Neal's been really, really strong, I guess, across the last 6 or so weeks, but they don't have the easiest run home, the Lions. They have some pretty big competitors, and I think, like you said, it's probably going to be the top 3. Dacos and Bont have been neck and neck most of the year, and Petrarca's always kind of been applying a bit of pressure. It'll be interesting to see if Clayton Oliver does make a return, what influence that might have. But between Dacos and Bontempelli, I think it's going to be one of those 2 by the end of it.
Yeah, interesting stuff. All right. Well, that wraps it up for Zero Hanger TV for this week. Thanks, Mitch.
Thanks, Phoenix.
And don't forget, you can catch all the latest AFL news at zerohanger.com.